So we learned something very profound, that the story of Egypt and the slavery of the Jewish people is not a story of punishing Pharaoh specifically. We're talking specifically about Pharaoh because he couldn't escape it. It's not about him being punished for what he did, because what he did was destined. The fact is that Hashem wanted the Jewish people to be slaves. And the only way that you could facilitate that is you have to have a king who has a reason to enslave the Jews, or a motivation to enslave the Jews. So that was inescapable, and he's not punished for the fact that the Jews were slaves. What is he punished for? His attitude and his intention, the way he reveled in the role. He didn't drag his feet saying, Nebuch, I'm the executioner that Hashem has appointed. He embraced this with passion and enthusiasm. This is what I want to do. Thank God he chose me. And that's why, as the story goes, he did a little bit more than he had to, because the prediction, the prophecy was that there'd be slaves. And he went all out, murdering babies and abusing the people and so forth. So that's what's wrong with
himself as being a god.
Correct, but that doesn't affect the Jews. Okay. Here we're talking about things that affect the Jews. So with that information, we're going to now go back to understand why it is that the Rambam tells us that if a person has inaccurate weights and measures in their home, they're denying this concept of Egypt, this concept of what the Exodus of Egypt represents. Why? Because it's a similar mentality. In other words, let's just understand, the issue that we learned around Egypt is that a person is not judged solely on what they do to somebody else, but they're judged very much on what their thinking is and what their attitude is. So when it comes to theft, a person is judged for what they did to somebody else. They took something from another person. So that's very much about the effect on the victim. But the weights and measures, as we've seen, the Gemara is very clear about it, and the Torah is very clear about it, that the problem is not defrauding somebody because you've got these inaccurate weights and measures. The problem is just having the weights and measures. That's the problem. In other words, it's a problem in a person's attitude. Their attitude to honesty is not like it should be. If I think it's satisfactory to have something that I own, which is technically dishonest, then it tells you I've already veered somewhat from the world of integrity. So any person who believes that as long as nobody else gets harmed, what I'm doing is okay, that's a person who denies the whole principle of what happened in Egypt. Where the principle is, it's not about the harm that was caused, because that was predestined. It's about the intention that the person had. It's quite a useful perspective, because so often people say, what's the difference? As long as nobody else got harmed, what's the difference that I'm doing in my own world? Now let's take this a step further, because there's another shocker that you don't necessarily expect. There is another Torah source, I believe it's a Midrash, that says because of the sin of people not having accurate weights and measures, that is why Amalek attacked the Jewish people. Now, that's a very radical statement, because if you go back into the actual story, the original story, the Torah tells us that what happened immediately before Amalek attacked the Jewish people didn't have anything to do with weights and measures. It was something that actually sounds a lot more fundamental. So what are we going on about over here, saying that there's this link between weights and measures and Amalek? So let's first contextualize, who is Amalek and why is Amalek such a big deal? So there's a verse. It comes from one of the enemies of the Jewish people, who later had no option but to give us the biggest brachas, Bilam. Remember Bilam, right? He also had bad intentions, even though what came out at the end was positive. And that's why Bilam eventually is punished, because despite the fact that there was no ill effect on his victims, because his intentions were malicious, he was still punished. So again, I just want to be clear, it's not about a person who had bad intentions that don't turn into anything. They can't be punished for intentions. We're talking about where they actually try to do something. He actually tried to hurt the Jewish people, and therefore he's punished, even though he wasn't successful. So Bilam says, Reishis Goyim Amalek. Amalek is the first of all the nations. Chronologically, that's not accurate. Chronologically, there were other nations that existed before Amalek. Just for context, Amalek is a descendant of Esav, By the time Esav appeared on the scene, there were already Canaanites and Hittites and Girgashites and all these other people. They all existed. So what does Bilam mean when he says that Amalek is Reishis Goyim, the first of all the nations?
Maybe the first of the nations to hate the Jews.
Well, the first of the nations to attack the Jews. That's what he means. The first of the nations to attack the Jews. And in context, it's a very big deal, because when you read Oz Yashir, which is basically first-hand testimony of what was going on in the world at the time of the Exodus, so we say over there that all the nations were literally trembling in their boots because they saw the great, not just miracles, but the incredible devastation of Egypt, which was the world superpower at the time. So everybody was afraid of the Jews. Amalek comes along and says, what are you talking about? It's not such a big deal. You're overplaying this. We can handle the Jews. Which, by the way, became the theme song of anti-Semites throughout the whole of history. Right? We could take the Jews down. Like, we all believed the same thing. So Reishis Goyim Amalek. Amalek is the first of the nations that rose up against the Jewish people, because Amalek started the trend that you could actually hate and fight against Jewish people. Now, what happens there is a little bit more developed than just some kind of base hatred. Because I'm sure you've heard this before. If you take the name Amalek, it's got the same gematria. The letters of that name have the same numerical value as letters of the word Safek, which is doubt. So what Amalek did was to sow the seeds of doubt in people's minds. In other words, like this. Just imagine that in those days, if you had an interview with a Canaanite, you had an interview with a Midianite, at that time, after the story of the Exodus from Egypt, they'd all be saying, we've never seen anything like this. We can't believe what happened. Egypt was the superpower. We all kind of relied on Egypt to keep the world safe. And they had this group of slaves. And the next thing, that group of slaves turned around and in quick succession dismantled the whole of Egypt. So what happens if they come for us? We're done for. And that was a fear that lasted for 40 years. We have evidence for that, because when Joshua sends his spies to check the best way to attack Jericho to be able to get into the promised land, they meet up with a woman called Rachav, and she tells them, people still till today speak about the incredible miracles of the Exodus from Egypt, and they're still afraid today, 40 years later. So in everybody's minds, it's 100% clear you don't start up with the Jews, because crazy things happen. The next, 1 minute will be frogs, and the next minute you'll be done. Amalek comes along and says, maybe you're overreacting. Maybe it was just a little bit of coincidence. Maybe it was because the Egyptians were very brutal people, so that's why they were treated this way. And you guys are not so brutal. Maybe you won't be treated so badly. So in other words, what Amalek essentially does is sows the seeds of doubt in the whole story. Everybody's so convinced that there were miracles, and they were so convinced that you've got to keep hands off the Jewish people. Amalek comes along and says, maybe not. So there's a deep message in this, which is that the deeper representation of Amalek, besides the fact that they were really people who actually existed, and there was actually such a nation. But like everything else in the Torah is not a book of history, the Torah is not a book of stories, the Torah is a book of instruction. It's a book to teach us how that we should live our lives in the best way possible. So it's telling us that there is Amalek in our own psyche. And the Amalek in our own psyche is Reishis Goyim. It's the beginning of all the negative thought processes that a human being could have. All the things that would interfere with us doing what Hashem wants. So where does the problem start? Where do the wheels begin to come off? When Amalek gets into our heads. What's Amalek? Safek. When I'm not so sure about what I believe. Now let's plug that back into the story. There is a line in the Torah that is the line immediately before the attack of Amalek. So that's obviously intentional. And that's obviously supposed to teach us how it is that Amalek got to attack the Jewish people. So what's the line immediately before? It says that the Jewish people complained to Moshe. Okay, no surprises there. What did they complain about? They said, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im oyin. Is Hashem truly with us or not? That's doubt. Just a few days earlier, they were absolutely certain that Hashem was with them. How do we know? Because they crossed that border out of Egypt, something that nobody had done for 200 years. Not only no Jewish person, no slave had left the borders of Egypt for 200 years. You know what that's like? I'll tell you what it's like. Imagine that you're in a room that is completely dark and the door is jammed. You can't get out of this room. And then after a few hours that feel like an eternity, eventually there's a rescue crew. The fire department comes. This wouldn't happen in Johannesburg, but right, and bashes the door open to let you out. But as they bash the door open, they also have these very powerful flashlights that they're using to be able to see, to be able to find you. So you're now blinded by these flashlights. It's not going to be so easy to walk out because you'll be completely disoriented. You can't see where you're going. So you're going to have a lot of trust in the team that you can actually walk because you can't see where you're walking. Now multiply that out across the experience of being slaves in Egypt for 200 years. That's everything that you know, that your parents know, that your grandparents know, etc. So if they were willing to follow Moshe out of Egypt, directly into the desert, with their little children, they obviously were confident. They obviously believed the story. If they hadn't believed the story, they would have vacillated at the border. But they all went, so they clearly had, at some point, very strong faith and clarity about what they should be doing. But a few weeks go by, and in those few weeks, they have miracle after miracle. They have the manna that starts to provide them with food. They have the miraculous well of Miriam that just appears wherever they are in the desert with fresh water. And they cross the sea in the most miraculous event that they'd ever experienced. So at that point, you'd think, wow, they should really have clarity right now. But the human mind is a bit of a funny thing. And so not very long after the miracle of the splitting of the sea, they say, Hayesh Hashem b'kirbeinu im ayin. Is Hashem really with us? It's a ridiculous thought that they could have doubt so early on in the story. But that's the human condition. The minute they have that seed of doubt, is Hashem maybe not looking after us? They become vulnerable to Amalek. The very next line in the Torah, Vayavoy Amalek vayilochem b'Yisrael b'Refidim, that this nation of Amalek attacks the Jewish people in a place called Refidim, which the sages say comes from the word Rafu Yedeim in our mitzvahs, that they started to loosen their grip on the mitzvahs that they were doing. Because that's what happens when people start to feel doubts. When a person feels doubts, they're not so committed to what they're doing. When a person is not so committed to what they're doing, then they don't get the value out of the things that they should be doing. So the first step of any decline is doubt. Think about it, not only in a spiritual sense. Think about it. Imagine somebody's going to sell their business idea to an investor. And they come along and they say, this is brilliant, I'm telling you, you've got to invest in my company. I've solved the biggest problem in the modern world, whatever that might be. I've found a way to get teenagers to floss their teeth. Right? This is it. I've changed. I'm going to change the world. And then the investor asks a few probing questions. If at some point during that interview the person starts to think, maybe I've missed something, that's the beginning of the end. It's the beginning of the investor saying, listen, I don't think you believe in your product. Why should I believe in your product? So the beginning of all decline is insecurity, doubt. Therefore, Amalek is the first of all attacks against the Jewish people, because what the attacks against the Jewish people really represent is things that get Jewish people not to behave like Jewish people. That's really what the so-called nations of the world represent. And the various nations, they represent different things. So one nation represents conflict. Midian represents conflict within the Jewish community. When there's disunity, that's going to break us into, and weaken us. And then you've got, for example, Amalek. Well, as we've seen, Amalek represents doubt. And then you've got various other nations that represent various things: temptation, indulgence, promiscuity, etc. But none of them can get a foot in the door unless there's a crack in the door. And that crack in the door is this sense of doubt. That's why we say, Reish is going Amalek, because by rights, but thanks to our neshama, because our neshama is so powerful, we really should not ever falter in our spiritual mission. Why do we? Because sometimes we doubt the power of our own neshama or the truth of the story that Judaism tells us. That's how every problem begins. If we didn't have any doubts, if we were absolutely certain, we'd be immune to any kind of spiritual decline. So the Midrash tells us that if a person has dishonest weights and measures, then that is the first crack in the door. Because ultimately, there's a Gemara that tells us there's no way in the world that the Yetzer Hara would ever tell a person outright, please reject Hashem. That's what I would really like from you. Imagine if your Yetzer Hara came to tell you, listen, what you need to do, the next thing you need to do is you've got to reject your Judaism, you've got to reject God. So nobody would do that. So what does the Yetzer Hara do? Says the Gemara, Hayoim oimer loy aseh kach. Today, the Yetzer Hara makes a very subtle suggestion. And then the next day, the suggestion is just a little bit bolder. And then it so goes day after day after, until eventually it gets to the point where we say, what do I need this for? In other words, they call it in English, the slippery slope. That the whole devolving of a person's spirituality all starts with one crack in the door. If there's no crack, nothing could happen. It's like a structure, right? If the structure has structural integrity, nothing can happen. If there's one crack, that crack can grow and expand and eventually can undermine the entire structure. So what's the crack? The crack is where a person thinks, as long as I don't hurt anybody, what I do is my business. That's the crack. And that's what these inaccurate weights and measures represent. Because the inaccurate weights and measures, I'm just keeping it on my mantelpiece. I don't ever plan to use the scale. It's not an issue. I'm just going to keep it here. It's going to be a decorative item in my home. Which basically means, I'm just going to borrow another concept that the Rebbe speaks about, where the Rebbe says why it's so valuable to have a Jewish library in your home. Most people think if I'm going to have a Jewish library and I'm not going to use the books, then that's just very hypocritical, right? But the Rebbe says there's another reason to have a Jewish library in your home, and that is that it sets the tone of what kind of a house this is. Like it's more difficult to do things that are inappropriate when you've got this set of Gemaras staring at you. So the things that we have in our home, they actually subtly set the tone for what our value system is. So this is what the Torah is telling us and what the Rambam specifically is telling us. So if I'm willing to have in my house, even if it's not for practical use, but if I'm willing to have in my house things that are not honest, what I'm effectively saying is I don't believe that dishonesty is toxic. Because I wouldn't have a jar of poison sitting in my house. Listen, we don't plan to use it. We just got the arsenic on the top shelf. It will never be used just because I like the look of the skull and crossbones on the bottle. So that's why I decided I'm going to put it. Nobody would ever do that, right? Nobody would say, listen, I don't intend to use it, but I'm going to have this big fancy sword sitting in my child's bedroom. But we're not going to use it. It fits in with the decor of the home. If something is that objectionable, it's not coming in my house. So if a scale is inaccurate or a weight is inaccurate, that should, for us, it should be absolutely unacceptable. I would never go near that because it symbolizes that it's okay to compromise your integrity. It's not about whether you're going to compromise your integrity with regards to somebody else. To me, integrity is so important. I can't even have a symbolic version of dishonesty in my house. Because if I do, I've let Amalek through the door. I've allowed in a little bit of maybe it's not so serious. And when a person allows in the maybe it's not so serious kind of thinking, that can evolve into outright theft without even thinking about it. So let's translate that into something we can all relate to, right? Can all relate to. How often in today's world do people say things like, but everybody does it? Or, this is how you do business in Africa. It's exactly the same mentality, right? Where essentially the person is saying, I'm not a bad person. This is just how things are.
When in Rome.
When in Rome, exactly. Exactly. That's the message of this story. That if I don't have absolute clarity, that something which is not honest is absolutely objectionable, I have a crack in the door. And nobody can predict what can get through that crack. That's why the Rambam says, if you remember, the Rambam says that this mitzvah of honest weights and measures is there to remind us of the Exodus from Egypt, because the Exodus from Egypt is the beginning of the Jewish story. It's the beginning of what it means to live with the values and the integrity that Hashem expects of us. So it's right at the beginning of that story that you've got to get this thing right. You've got to be clear on what honesty looks like. And he went on to say, it's the beginning of all the mitzvahs. Why is it the beginning of all the mitzvahs? Because unless a person is rock solid when it comes to honesty and integrity, all the other mitzvahs potentially could be vulnerable. Because if I'm not absolutely clear about how I behave in the privacy of my own secure environment, then I can't be guaranteed the integrity of anything that I do. Today, of course, I'm 100% on the ball. But the minute there's a crack in integrity, it could later on become a chasm in integrity. It's a very, very powerful lesson and message, eh?
Great. Thank you very much.